Great turnout here today. So what we want to address is basically the next set of challenges over the next few years for companies that have raised Series A. Recently, there's been a few, Grab, Taxi, e-commerce. What do the challenges look like for those sort of companies going forward to raise their next round of funding? So we have a pretty diverse panel here, a number of both entrepreneurs that have raised quite a bit of amount of funding, have done it in very different ways, and investors that are also looking for that kind of growth stage opportunity. So to start off, I think it might be nice just to let everybody kind of share a little bit of an experience that they've had in terms of looking at investments in that size, or for some of the founders who have actually raised money, some of the challenges that they faced.
Hi, I'm Alex. Infocomm investment has been around for quite a long time. Okay, if you really check the history, it's more than 10 years old. We have been investing in the so-called growth stage company. That means at stage B and beyond. What we discover is that if there is nothing in front, that means a Series A or even seed stage, you hardly able to find a lot of Series B and beyond company around this region. So what we are doing right now is that we begin to move down, and so we work with the ecosystem people, moving down to Series A as well as the seed stage. In fact, we just joined the fund of the JFDI and working with them to groom the first batch of their accelerator.
I'm Peng. I spent the last 3 years plus in China investing as a VC in Beijing, and just moved back this year. It's for those that you don't know, it's kind of hard to breathe in Beijing now. And I looked at the numbers and I realized there's a huge opportunity, which is the Series A, Series B gap that my friend Keylog, I'm not sure if he's here, talks about all the time, right? And there is indeed, because of the activities in the market, there are now a lot of companies in the region. I think our list is more than 1,000 that are sort of angel seed level. They're all raring to go, but there's not a lot of funding beyond that. So I'm setting up a fund to go after Series A and B. So it's a bit early stage and a bit growth. I look forward to actually a very active tech scene in the next few years, next 5-10 years, I think. I don't know if, for those of you who pay attention to schools, this year there's a sudden jump in the intake of computer science students, both in places like Stanford. I think it's 10% of this year's entering class are doing computer science. And in NUS, the grades, the average grades to get into computer science jumped like one grade, actually 2 grades for some of the subjects. So it's becoming very clear to even the students that this is going to be a huge market.
Hi, I'm Edgar. I'm the CEO of SingTel Innovate, SingTel's corporate venture fund. We have been around for actually just under 4 years, and I've had the opportunity to travel extensively around Southeast Asia, looking and meeting with the various startup ecosystem communities in Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia. And I think from what I saw 4 years ago to now, it's very clear that the quality and the quantity in terms of the startups that are coming out of this region is fast accelerating. And I personally believe that the opportunity similar to Peng things, I think it's a great opportunity in the coming years to be a Southeast Asian startup. It's still going to be hard work. It's not going to be plain sailing, but I definitely see more opportunities for startups in this region, not only within their home markets, but in markets around the region as well.
Good day, everyone. My name is Stephen Goh. So I founded Australia's first online stockbroking company, listed 122 other companies, raised $750 million for others, floated them around the world, Europe, Asia, Australia, USA. The company I'm most passionate about now is the one that I'm running, which is MiG33, which has now become MiGMe as of today. Founded originally in Australia, raised about 25 million in US in venture funding in Silicon Valley, which was fantastic. Grew everywhere in the world other than North America, so we moved out here to Singapore. We raised $20 million here in post-Series C funding. Most recently, taking a strategic holding from a company called Foxconn. They make an awful lot of phones, amongst other stuff. We're currently going through we're going through a listing process at the moment, where we expect to be quoted on the Australian Stock Exchange sometime in July.
Hi, everyone. My name is Akshay, and I co-founded Komli Media, which is a company that started out of India, out of Mumbai about 8 years ago. I've been based here in Singapore for nearly 4, and across the rest of this region as well. We're the largest independent digital advertising platform across this part of the world, across India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand. That's sort of the axis that we actually focus on. And we've raised actually north of $80 million to date in venture capital funding across 5 rounds, and we're actually hopeful of actually going public sometime next year. So I'm happy to share more about some of that experience as well as some of the challenges that we've seen along that journey in the last 8 years.
But actually, to jump in directly with that, so your most recent round was a Series E round?
That's right.
So yeah, could you talk about some of the challenges of, maybe even start with what did your Series A round look like? Who'd you raise that from? And then what the next few subsequent rounds look like?
Sure. So our Series A was in very early 2008. We announced it in February of 2008. That was actually from DFJ out of the US, Draper Fisher Jurvetson. They didn't even have a presence in Asia at that point in time, so that was out of their fund in the Valley. And 2 very new funds that had just set up shop in India in 2007, Nexus as well as Echelon Ventures. Our Series E, which was the most recent round, was from a private equity group called People Capital. That's P-E-E-P-U-L, right? I mean, for the longest time, I was confusing their spelling as well, and emails were bouncing back with a very high frequency. But they're also actually based out of India, but they have a little bit more of a pan-Asia focus in terms of their investment thesis. They're very focused on Asian companies that are essentially targeting the broader region. And I'm really sorry. While I was explaining that, I forgot the core thrust of your question.
You started to begin with Series A, but then what did that process look like after Series A?
Sure. So I'll focus a little bit more on the most recent round. I mean, I think as you grow, look, the milestones always change, right? And it's not always the same milestones as well. So obviously they change in terms of the numerical aspect, but they also change qualitatively. At a certain stage, it might really just be about the number of clients that you've activated on your platform. At a certain stage, it's actually about the revenue that you're probably seeing, right? At another stage, it's really about, for example, hitting profitability as well as owning a certain share of the market. What I will share from our experience at Komli is that I would say in the last 7 to 8 years, the way we've seen some of those milestones change is that our most recent round was, in terms of core, I would say, or most important variables around our valuation, they were really around, are we profitable or not, or how close we are to that, right? Because that's how a lot of private equity investors and late stage investors typically look at a sustainable business in the longer run. And we were also valued in terms of our share of the market. So typically, if you're a company like us, which has been around for a while, which has a fairly high revenue run rate, which is thinking about a public exit, investors, at least in this part of the world, are looking to make sure that you will be profitable in the near future, that you also own a very significant share of the market, just because that creates a slightly more defensible position.
Thank you. Stephen, would you mind sharing a little bit about what you're planning to do with this reverse merger, why you took that approach, and what sort of opportunity it offers?
I think, like everyone else on this panel, I have the same outlook that this region is exploding with opportunity, and that opportunity is now. I think the center of the world has moved, and if you haven't noticed it, you can just see what the data is saying. The rise of the internet in this region is different to the rise of the internet in many first world countries, and this whole region is just exploding with opportunity. The shift in positioning of the business means that we can now grow the company through acquisition and by partnership. Listing the company gives us the ability to access capital in a very different way than we were accessing capital offline. We looked at a range of different markets for listing. I looked at AIM, Xetra, NASDAQ, Singapore, some of the other regional exchanges in Australia. Ultimately made the decision in December to list in Australia, simply because it's a matter of time. We could get it done very, very quickly, and it's an internationally recognized and credible market. Really excited. We've made one acquisition so far, which we've announced, which is Alive Not Dead. I'm super happy with that. Recently relaunched ourselves today as MigMe. Got a string of other acquisitions and investments that we'll be looking forward to announcing later this year.
And just to, because some of the questions that are coming in to follow up on the opportunity in this region, because some of these questions are around like the Internet of Things, Bitcoin, private label e-commerce. I actually look at those as like very, very global plays. But in terms of opportunities in this region, what are some of those that you see?
I would say that it's. I would say the world is now regionalizing very, very quickly, and you can look at this as, say, the success of Line in Thailand versus the success of, say, Facebook in Vietnam. You know, the reality is that the world is now becoming regionalized. So many of these questions here, like importance of Bitcoin, which I don't have I'm not very fond of, but because I've got a financial service background, and the Internet of Things, I think the reality of these things are going to be used very, very differently in these markets than it is, say, in the North American example. The US market is a very, very functional market. People use technology in a very functional sense. It's very functional, very algorithm driven. In Asia, it's light, noisy, playful, implicitly extremely mobile. As a result of that, the shape of the internet, when it comes to the shape of the Internet of Things, which I think has just got to be one of the most exciting things on the horizon, it'll be very different to the North American case.
Thank you. Edgar, if you could follow up with just the role of kind of strategic investments, corporate venture, how SingTel's looking at the market. Could you share some insight there?
Yeah, sure. So I think for SingTel and SingTel Innovate, you know, SingTel Group's footprint is very much predominantly in Southeast Asia and India as well. And for us, one of our key theses is that there are problems and challenges in this part of the world that unless you live here, unless you experience them day to day, you wouldn't either know they exist or would be motivated to solve them. And I think and Silicon Valley continues to be the beacon of in terms of innovation. But I think for us, what we're hoping to see and what we're trying to do and help in terms of contribute towards is an ecosystem here in Southeast Asia, which allows local entrepreneurs to solve what we see as local problems. Where we see that, you know, once again, it's to Stephen's points about it's localization of the opportunity in terms of what does IoT mean for Asia? What does IoT mean for the US? It's going to mean different things. And I think what we have here is an ecosystem that is rapidly growing. It still requires a lot of support and help. And I think this is where corporates and strategics like SingTel are able to contribute in terms of our go-to-market resources, our brand, and to bring awareness to some of these opportunities. And so that's where I think that we hope to be able to try and support these new startups as they emerge from around this region.
And just to follow up on that theme then of Internet of Things, anything else you guys would like to comment on?
So the way I look at this, as we're studying all the different sectors that are interesting to invest in, our conclusion actually is actually not surprising. You know, there are lots of sectors which you can build pretty significant companies in, but bottom line is we care about the people that are going to make it happen. So bottom line is still the entrepreneurs, still the team.
I see you. Alex?
Okay, I mean, just jump in a little bit. Now here is that what we are looking at, I mean, IIPL being a wholly owned subsidiary of IDA, our investment is largely strategic. What we are trying to do is that we want to build Singapore into a place where if you think of tech startup, this is probably one of the stops you want to be here. And when you start looking at this particular vision that investment become our vehicle, it's a way to make things happen. So largely is that even just taking the question down there, what do you think about Internet of Things? Only last week when I was in Thailand, something interesting happened. Thailand, as you know, that is basically they produce rice. And in the farm, they use a lot of sensors, and there are Arduino's sensor around down there. And together with me is a Taiwanese who is a scientist. And what happened is that we can look at what is happening in Taiwan and making something, the sensor become a small little sensor with a wireless in Taiwan, because the technology down there is pretty good. And Singapore being a business innovator. Now, when such thing happen, because we're in the discussion and say, hey, if this thing happen, the entrepreneurship is no longer so-called located in one country, right? So in Singapore, what we think is that we're going to be a good teammate. We are part of this ecosystem. We are not one ecosystem by itself. So investment become a vehicle to make such thing happen, right? So we are looking at the investment in a very, very broad spectrum. Could be right from acceleration to acceleration plus. That means that after the acceleration, that we try to push them and bring them further up before they reach Series A and go into Series A and B. So this is the whole context we are looking at in terms of investment, in terms of developing the ecosystem. And of course, as what my fellow panelists say is that this is a very new opportunity. I would say that this area we are still pretty new. Okay, it is a lot of opportunity for us to develop further.
I was just going to jump in that for the Internet of Things, if you look at the dominant chipsets used for most wearable devices, they're all based off a MediaTek set of chipsets. And the old MRE OS, which powered many of the cheap Chinese phones, has now evolved into the OS that runs the IoT devices, or many things that you're seeing occurring in the wearable space. So if you actually look at the set of relationships coming out of this part of Asia as to what is the future of, this is the operating system for what runs the connected internet, it's really exciting, and it really comes back to companies in this region now just taking more advantages of some of the linkages within this region.
I do have a quick comment on that. I mean, I definitely agree with you, Stephen, that there's a lot of hardware innovation with MediaTek, a few other companies, Taiwan as well. But just using the Internet of Things just as an example, as an analogy, I mean, I'm a little bit pessimistic about, can you expect, or should you even expect, groundbreaking technologies around something like that here in Asia today, right? And I know that's a broad generalization. I'm not saying it can't happen. But if you think about Internet of Things, I mean, the poster child is the acquisition of Nest, right, by Google recently. And this is really about connecting all your smart devices, making it a very smart home, doing a lot more than that, things that I don't even understand just yet. And to really innovate at that level, you have to live in that environment. It goes back to the point that Edgar was talking about in terms of finding smart entrepreneurs who are actually living here and building things locally for Asia. Unless you're living in an environment like that, you can't fundamentally innovate and do something that is groundbreaking. And we're living in a very different environment. It doesn't mean we don't have smart homes, but we just don't think about these things, or we don't live our lives in the same way that someone does in a very smart home in the United States today, unless you're in Japan, right? My point being that, sure, we might do something with the Internet of Things, but it might look very, very, very different from what Nest looks like in the United States today.
Thank you. I have an interactive question. By a show of hands, how many people have actually raised a round of funding for their startup? Okay, thank you. So that only goes into my next question, which is what I thought a bit of a racist one, but it's the most voted. Do you see Caucasians having better chances in raising?
What a load of crap.
But I saw many different groups of people raise, or different backgrounds raising their hands. So at least from a visual cue, that didn't seem that way to me. But
you're just insecure.
As always. Does anybody want to share some comments about that being the most popular question?
No. White fellas can't jump. Yeah. No, I'm sorry. So in all seriousness.
Sorry, I'm actually amazed this question is 10 votes. Seriously?
This is the number one question, and
Just
I'm also amazed.
So firstly, get over it. Look, fundraising and financing is ultimately, people are going to invest in you because you're the business. It's not the idea. The idea is mildly interesting. And invariably, whatever idea you come up with is going to go wrong. It's going to go really wrong. It's going to go really wrong. And ultimately, people are investing in you. So it comes back to people are investing in you as a brand or as a person, and with all the relationships around you. So when you look at, say, how do people raise money based on either cultural stereotypes or connected into professional stereotypes or whatever it might be. I mean, quite frankly, look, I've got a finance background. There's no way I would have been able to keep this business running if I didn't have a finance background. So I know I have a brand back in finance. Those things may help you. This question here, quite frankly, get over it. This is the most exciting part of the world that you could be in. If you look at all the major fundraisings that are going on at the moment, grab taxi, you look at the listing expected from MOL, you look at investments going on in Indonesia at the moment, you look at what's going on in whatever. It's just ridiculous. I mean, get over it.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to reinforce that point of view. I mean, if you're thinking this way, you probably lack some confidence, right? Go find your confidence and move on with life.
Which is why I'm amazed that 10 people voted for this question. Right. But just a quick nuance on that, right, guys? This is not about race. I mean, someone can be a Caucasian, but they've lived in, I mean, who is the founder of Chunar, right? Fritz Demopoulos, right? American guy, white guy, German to the 110th percent, right, when it comes to racial stock. Speaks better Mandarin than 90% of Chinese guys, right? And he's built Chunar, sold it, built another company before that as well in China. I mean, it doesn't matter what race you are, but you have to know the local environment. I mean, I'm actually, honestly, I'm going to walk away being stunned about this for a bit. 10 people asking this question.
14 now.
Move on.
Okay, being a cognitive psychologist, I'm actually looking at the question slightly differently because the 10 people agree that this is a good question, which also means that there's certain sentiment about it. And yes, maybe the Angmo is able to raise money. But if you drill further down, actually, what my experience about looking at some of the local who pitch is that the ability to pitch is very, very different from the Caucasians' ability to pitch. Now, all this knowledge are all available on the internet, and you study about how to do presentation and everything, but somehow the pitch just doesn't come true. We went to startup weekends, and it's very interesting. I just want to cite one example. Is that one particular team who were coached by one of my friends who is a professional coach about presentation. And I know exactly what the style is supposed to be. But when the presentation comes, he rubber band. We call it rubber band. That means it's flip back to the old style, which I asked him, why? Why didn't you use what you learned? And he said, well, he's more comfortable the original style. So whichever way that he's being taught, okay, if you have not changed and improved, you will always feel the same way. The knowledge is all available out there. The knowledge is on the internet. You can go to Nancy Duarte websites and all these things. You can learn all these things. But then if you don't practice, you build back to the square thing. All right. So ultimately, is what Peng says, that the confidence. What makes you more confident is basically you practice and practice and practice, and eventually you will get there.
So maybe I'll chime in since everyone else has. I was in Thailand about 3 weeks ago judging at an AI startup event. And, most of the people there are Thais, and they don't, the command of English isn't as eloquent as some other people's. But they did me the honor of pitching to me in English, right? And for me, I was less concerned about whether they had their grammar right, whether they pronounced the words correctly. What I was looking at was the passion in terms of to what extent were these guys passionate about what they were trying to convey. Because, they may not have been able to articulate themselves well, but they had great presentation slides, and I could understand from that. But for me, it's not about what's the color of your skin, but it's in terms of how passionate about the idea that you're trying to solve. And I think that's far, far more important than whether you're you have an Oxford background and you're educated in the UK and you have a, fair skin versus anything else. So it's very, to me, do you believe in what you're trying to do? Do you have the confidence to go out there and change the world? And where's that passion? And I can tell you, I mean, when I was so impressed by the startups I saw in Thailand, they were all incredibly passionate about what they're trying to do. And none of them spoke great English. And I wouldn't expect them to. But to me, that was the far more important piece. So I totally agree. I think this is I'm not very sure where this question came from, and I'm also amazed that it's 14 or, I don't know, it's probably more by now, 15. It's going up. 15 people have voted for this, but I don't think it's something which we should be looking and thinking about.
Agree, and I just want to chime in. Yeah, if you're one of these 15 people and you feel that you're being unfairly discriminated against, please come to bitch to me. I don't care if you're glowing neon green. As long as you've built a company that has growth, that's the number one thing I care about. All right, thank you, everybody. But then that goes to our next most popular question. So, do you think that government funding is overcrowding private monies in the case of Singapore?
Okay, a short answer is yeah, there's a lot of government funding around there. When we talk about government funding, typically I think you refer to grants, right? So grants serve a particular purpose. Grants serve to build up capabilities such as TEC technology company commercialization scheme. So these are the government grants to help to build capability while the capability is not strong, right? But in terms of a business, okay, what we will discourage is basically what do you call it, grant junkie. That means that there's a lot of people, a lot of businesses are out there depend on grants to survive. The moment the grants disappear, they basically can die. Now, one of the constant thing that I will always ask the people who apply for grants is that, number one, understand, grant is not 100%. Okay? Although grants are no string attached, but it's not never 100%. There's a commitment in there. And a lot of people think that the grant is easy to take, where you're going to apply it, because there's a lot of condition behind it. Now, most importantly is that if the grant got no string attached, a lot of time people take it too lightly, and what will happen is that the company actually get penalized by themselves. Take one, for example, some of the grants that will ask for letter of interest from your potential customer. This is to basically have an indication of whether what you produce, what you build, is there a customer, is there a market or not? So a lot of people that's basically getting a letter of interest is not that difficult. But imagine that if a $500,000 grants, you would have come out with 150,000. That means it costs you 150,000 to get a $500,000 grant. It will take about 2 years for you to develop products. Now, if you don't really have a customer, at the end of it, you have nothing because there's no business. Now, if you were to continue the business, that means you're going to spend another $500,000 or your own money plus 150,000, your own money plus another 2 more years. All in all, you will spend about 800,000 plus 4 years. Think about it. So that is some of the lesson that people want to understand in terms of grants and government funding, right? It will help you, okay, but most importantly, you must know where you are going. So always go in and know what you are building. So is it overcrowding? I don't think so. But basically, it will help those companies that have an idea, maybe it's a bit too early, maybe not ready to apply, get the investment. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other comments?
No, I guess I should say something since I've been on both sides of it. It's very interesting when you have an ecosystem that hasn't developed like this place 7 years ago. What do you do to get it to this stage, right? My bet is if the government had just did nothing, right, nothing would happen. We're not like a continental economy like the US where by chance a Silicon Valley can develop, right? And even then there'll be people who argue whether Silicon Valley would have developed without the government's intervention, the federal government's intervention. So I was part of some of the groups that were trying to push a lot of the investment seeding in Singapore, both at the NRF and at IDA. And the risk we run is actually, I think, less about the startup phase, which I think we're kind of succeeding in getting it going. We're about a 10th, Singapore is about a 10th of the size of Israel in terms of the startup community, right? So we're still a long ways there. But what I worry about is once it gets going, that the government needs to back off. Like I'm raising a Series A and B fund. I would hate to have to compete with him in all the deals, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I know that's not going to happen, but there might be other government funds that aren't backing off sufficiently quick enough when the private sector comes in. I think that's the tricky part of what the government has to do.
That is one of the government philosophies that when the ecosystem is not working, we start off, okay, we take the risk. Just looking at Silicon Valley, that is basically a few war and this military technology that helped to start it. So in the same philosophy is that what we do is that we help the ecosystem before it is ready. Once the ecosystem is ready, we will step back and allow this ecosystem to continue.
I would jump in and say the fact of the matter is that Singapore is a country with 5.8 or 5.9 million people in it. The unemployment rate in this country is like 1 or 2%. If you're throwing more money into a particular sector, all you're going to have is either inflation, alternatively you're taking resources away from other parts of that sector. And I would suggest that government policy is probably better spent in reforming exit markets or the stock markets so that private capital or other capital can form and keep the sausage factory moving rather than potentially overfunding a startup environment where you've got a whole bunch of people in government where, the average person I've met hasn't set a startup before. They're public servants. They're allocating capital without the experience of allocating capital for startups, and they're distorting the market. So it's great to see that the government is being intentionally helpful, but I suspect from a matter of policy standpoint, it's incomplete. When you actually look at that funnel end to end about how do companies form and ultimately get exits, there's a lot more policy work at later stages of capital.
Okay, thanks. And so with that, I'm actually going to bring up a question to bring it back on point to topic. And I get the ability that I don't have to choose the most voted question. So the third question, which is an IPO still considered the holy grail for startups? Do you see alternative ways for a startup in Southeast Asia to exit or raise significant amounts of capital?
So,
Talked about this.
Hey, I'm listening, right? So, if you look, it's fantastic to see the amount of capital coming from East Asia being redirected in this region. So lots of people from China, Japan, and Korea especially, and also out of Australia. That's really interesting, and to see where the exits are happening in that sort of axis. When you actually see IPOs actually happening specifically in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, ... There's a range of question marks on the maturity of the state of those stock markets, which goes back to my comments earlier about the last question. If you do look at where capital is coming from for acquisitions, once again, fantastic. You're seeing it coming out of Japan. Great to see SoftBank being as active as it is in this region. SoftBank, Jafco, the list goes on. But once again, when you look at corporate specifically here coming out of Singapore, there's a question mark about, well, how the exits have been created or how they're taking risk. So you look at, once again, acquisitions like Amobi, the Hungry Go Where as examples, those sorts of things. It's going to be interesting to see what actually happens within this part of the region and not necessarily relying on either East Asia or Australia. If you are listing, in Australia, there's about a dozen multi-billion-dollar tech companies. There's about 8 or 9 which have valuations over $500 million, which have very specific Southeast Asian focus. iProperty, iCars Australia. I think you look at Seek and you look at Cars Australia and all those sorts of things investing in this region. There's actually a history. There's a trail there. If you are thinking about the holy grail of a startup, most guys who are in venture think of, and this is why you see in the tech blogs, they all think that an exit, someone other being an IPO, is somehow an exit. Actually, that's wrong. Typically, an IPO is an exit, particularly for institutional shareholders, as the baton is passed from one group of shareholders to another. Some employees can sell. But having said that, if you look at Larry and Sergey, they've substantially got all the shares that they had when they listed. You look at Mark Zuckerberg, he substantially got all the shares when he listed. And then the list goes on. Being listed is just another step on the journey to something else if you're a founder. So it'd be wrong to think of an IPO specifically as a founder or a company driver as necessarily being an exit. It's just another milestone.
That's a very good point. Thank you.
I'd love to actually just comment on the second part of this question, which is around alternate ways for startups in Southeast Asia to exit or raise capital. I think I'll answer that question a little bit indirectly. I mean, today the status quo is that there aren't that many exits, even non-IPO exits in Southeast Asia, which is to say that there's not that many buyers in the market, or there aren't enough companies that are ready enough where they can actually meet the minimum threshold of serious buyers. And what does that really mean? I mean, I think in Southeast Asia today, well, let me take a step back. I think it's just hard to scale across Southeast Asia, right? I think one of the things that we've actually found is Komli, while building a business here, and I would say a fairly successful business in the last 3 to 4 years in Southeast Asia, is that Southeast Asia, for a lot of people, is a political construct. And it is actually a political construct in reality, right? When you get down to building a business across 6, 7 different countries with different cultures, languages, legal systems, right, different taxation, regulatory requirements, it's not easy to actually scale across the region. What that really means is that there's a very few number of companies that are able to deal with those challenges, still create something which represents significant value, where a strategic investor might want to come in and actually buy you out. For the most part, if you're going to be a company which is doing really well in just one of these markets, and you're valued at, I don't know, $5-10 million, I mean, you're not really moving the needle for anyone out there unless you have an incredible amount of talent in your ranks, which the buyer is desperate to get at any cost. The point I'm trying to make is that I think there are a lot of issues just building and scaling businesses across Southeast Asia. It's not like it can't be done. The barriers are obviously high, but one of the things that we were talking about as a group of panelists earlier was that as the market matures and evolves, I mean, it is going to happen for sure. But today, my point of view is that here we're talking about exits here in Southeast Asia. If I were to ask any one of us or you, what do you think about the exit environment in Mercosur? You would look at me like I'm crazy, because no one really thinks about Mercosur, the South American trade belt, as one market. And I think that's still the issue here with a lot of buyers.
Let me just answer the first question, sort of almost philosophically. Is the IPO the Holy Grail? And I'll say no. The Holy Grail, I think, here in the Valley in China is to build a business institution that will last a long time. That's what we look for in entrepreneurs, right? The IPO is just one event in the life of your company, right? Or, well, if you sell your company, then that's an exit. But we're looking for people that really are serious about making a big difference in what they do in their business life, which is to build something that lasts a long time. And I think that attitude permeates some of the best entrepreneurs I know either side of the Pacific.
I just want to add to what Peng said, is that IPO basically is a milestone, and what we look for is that the people will be able to build company that lasts for a very long time and producing good job for the fellow citizens around them. Yeah.
Thanks. And so with that, I'll jump to now the another good highly voted question. What % of startups in Southeast Asia, in your experience, survive both beyond seed and Series A? And how does this compare to the Valley? Just wanted to pick that question because I thought with just 2 minutes left, it could just be high level. How do you see the scene right now comparing to the Valley? And maybe what needs to change to help the scene pick up?
I mean, compared to Valley, very quickly is that echo what Akshay is saying, that Valley is a very homogeneous place. It's 340 million people across the same language, same culture, watch the same movie, using the same currency. While in Southeast Asia, even you draw a 3-hour radius, you get the same population, but 10 different countries, 10 different cultures, etc. But the important thing about Southeast Asia is that if you're able to hack it and build a multiple, very, very flexible product and business, you basically can scale really fast and go beyond it. You just look at the WeChat. WeChat started off and he struggled because culturally, even within China itself, it's very, very diversified. But the moment he crossed that, he figured out he grew from 100 million to 400 million user. It's just within 2 years. It's way faster than other people. But you look at other US businesses, growing beyond US is difficult because you already built that mass. Trying to twist and change is actually quite difficult.
Thank you. Peng.
So I think it's not simple to I was actually reacting to your characterization of the U.S. market. It's actually a much more complex market than that. But the opportunities to really make a difference is there in many different ways. I mean, from the product perspective to the different cultural differences in the market, to the way different businesses are done differently. I think one of the more interesting conversations I had today was with Anthony Tan, who I think he was here earlier. Time's up. Okay. He basically described how, if you're an executive in this company, Grab Taxi, you're driving a cab one day a month, right? And that kind of entrepreneurial spirit, whether it's in Asia or somewhere else, makes all the difference in the quality of companies you build.
Thanks.
I would say pluggable monetization infrastructure. So if you look at the North American case, it's very easy for you to stay focused on a very specific thing like valuable engagement, and someone else can go and come in and monetize it for you. Here in Asia, you've got to be all singing, all dancing. You've got to do everything yourself. You've got to think about valuable engagement. You've got to think about monetization. You've got to think about the whole thing. And as a result of that, it is much harder in this region. It's both harder and it's also a fantastic opportunity because companies like SingTel, which is absolutely fantastic, could potentially be that infrastructure, which would just completely light the place up.
Yeah. Last comment.
Just a quick comment. I mean, my take on this is, Vinny, that it's really too early to make this comparison. Don't really think you can actually compare a 5-year-old's, I don't know, basketball prowess against a 20-year-old's. I think here, the serious seed and Series A ecosystem is probably only about 2 to 3 years old, right? I mean, my own take, having been in Asia for a little while now, China probably has a 10-year head start. India has a 5-year head start, right? And I think Southeast Asia is actually going to get to where some of these markets were in 3 to 5 years' time. And I think that's probably the right sort of duration of time at which to judge, has there been the same percentage of exits compared to some of those markets or even the United States. I think as of now, it's just way too early. These companies that have gotten funded in the last few years are just starting to walk. So I think it's really unfair to make that comparison today.
But I think the trend's in the right direction. If you look at from 5 years ago to now, you see the number of exits, the growth in the ecosystems, more companies getting funded. So I think we're definitely heading in the right direction.
Totally agree, yeah.
And just wrap up, I do love that analogy of like a 5-year-old versus a 20-year-old. And so where, you're never going to be happy if you're trying to say, how am I going to compete against that? But if you're just constantly working on your jump shot, improving yourself, you'll eventually get there and be able to compete at that level. So thank you, everybody. Very honored to be sharing the stage with these folks.